All right. So where we left off with Picasso, we were right on the edge of Cubism. If you were here for the last presentation, we looked at the great portrait that Picasso did of Gertrude Stein, and we could see he was heading somewhere. And where we begin with today's presentation is it's a period where you notice Picasso just storing up influences and ideas and references. You can see what a vacuum cleaner he was, what a powerful intellect he had, how curious he was. So I want to start you out with a survey of some of the things he'd been looking at in the few years leading up to the Demoiselles of Avignon. There's a tiny Iberian head here, ancient Spanish head on the left. And if you want to go on a Google birdwalk sometime, just Google Picasso Iberian head, and you'll find this incredible story of how a friend of Picasso's actually stole this from the Louvre when the Louvre was low security, and it ended up in Picasso's hands, and then it got returned, and it was just this whole wild story. But Picasso actually briefly had that head in his possession. And it maybe is where this kind of feeling of the almond eyes and the iconic ancient features in this little encaustic painting came from. He was taking a lot of interest in African art. And I believe in Paris, left over from one of the recent World Fairs, there was a display, there was a museum of exotic, colonial art that included things like this African fang mask. So Picasso, from the small encaustic, you can see he was looking at those. And Picasso's attitude about African art, I think, was very, very respectful. He saw something in African art that Western art had lost, that he thought could be something to help reignite his painting. He also, of course, was spending endless hours in the great French museums, including the Louvre. And one thing that's important to realize about Picasso is that his creative urges were also destructive urges. I mean, that's something that's been written about a lot. He had a tremendous sense of competition. And in fact, I think it was maybe at the end of the war, just after World War II, he actually worked with the curator and brought his work into the Louvre when it was closed and put it side by side some painters he admired and had this kind of face-off, which interestingly, he felt that he lost at the time, but very competitive. And I think that I think this great 19th century academic painter Ingres was somebody that Picasso was kind of taking aim at. He was taking aim at all of this, refinement and technique and fantasy. He saw something in it that was worth, restating. And of course, in 1906, the year that Cezanne died, he had visited, and George Braque had visited, the great Cezanne retrospective. And I think they went multiple times, and boy, were they looking hard at Cezanne. And it was going to make a big impact on both of their artwork. So Picasso started out in 1906 or 1907 and had this idea of make a very ambitious painting. And even though his finances weren't great, he got a double canvas, which was a big expense, started making sketchings and drawings. And his first idea, first subject matter he came up with was that he was going to have a medical student visit a bordello, and this painting was going to say something kind of allegorical or symbolic about syphilis, which I guess in some parlance, they used to call it the French disease. But so here you see an early sketch, you see in a sort of a deep brown suit, the medical student entering this, familiar brothel. And along the way, that idea got changed. And of course, as it got changed, all kinds of influences made their way into Picasso's sketches, including the influence of ancient Egyptian art, and definitely all of the other influences we just talked about, African art, Iberian art, definitely a dash of Ingres, and certainly some brushwork and some, roughness taken from Cezanne. And all of it came together in this tremendous painting, Demoiselles of Avignon. And I want to tell you what Georges Braque famously said when he saw this painting. He apparently said that seeing this painting in Picasso's studio was like drinking gasoline and then swallowing a lighted match, which, that's quite a way of saying explosive. But very few people saw this painting near the time it was made. It became a kind of a famous painting and conversation piece later. But in 1907, you have to imagine how strange and how aggressive this painting looked. And later in his life, Picasso actually talked about it as a kind of a creative exorcism painting. He actually called this a killing the witches painting, was something that he said about it. And it's interesting because he grew up in a home with 5 women, a mother and a sister and aunts, and that's been, given some psychological implications. But what you see in this painting is this kind of amazing broken space. And in fact, if the painting even has a space, I don't know quite how to describe it. It's a shattered mirror, a broken piece of glass. There do seem to be some kind of leathery curtains on each side that are being pushed back, but it's a confrontational image. And it's an image that destroys the academic notion of beauty that had been applied to women for so many years. So rather than a complacent or a sentimentalized woman like Ingres would have painted, passive woman, you get this tremendous sexual aggression. You get this confrontation. And among the things that add, I think, to the sense of violence in the picture, take a look at those pointed elbows. I know they make me nervous. I don't know how they make you feel. And that is probably the most threatening watermelon in the history of Western art, down there in the center of the painting with that little vestigial still life. So gone is the medical student, and also gone is the eunuch that Picasso had planned to be there as the guard for the painting. The males have been pushed out, and what you get is this tremendous almond-eyed ancient stare from these kinds of goddesses. And they look out at you. Some of them have fairly conventional features, but others have vestiges of African masks to suggest a whole different kind of culture and maybe a whole different kind of magic. And, there's so much to say about this painting. It's a whole seminar in itself, but I just think if you get creativity and destruction, and if you get the idea that the space of painting has been shattered and the conventional image of beauty has been shattered, I think you've got the right takeaway from that painting. And one more Picasso quote, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is roughly what he said. He said to somebody once, "If you think my art is ugly, wait till you see what comes in the future." So something to think about as we go forward. So the Demoiselles is thought of as the beginning of Cubism. And Cubism is a style of art that in the hands of many different artists, it changed quite a bit. It changed over time. Academics will tell you about different variations, but I'm just going to say, to give you a few points to get a grip on it for now. What is Cubism? It definitely is a style that attempts to see multiple points of view. And if you were at the Monday Morning Modernisms where we dealt with Cezanne, we know that Cezanne, gave that a try and was working on it. Picasso and Braque would take that much further. And to do that, to give multiplicity to imagery, it absolutely had to distort, flatten, shatter, put all your favorite verbs in there, destroy. It really had to violate the rules of three-dimensional space. And what a thing that was, especially when you consider that one of the big projects of Western art, going all the way back to the early Renaissance, was to make a systematic or scientific view of space, of dimensionality in paintings. So once everything was shattered, you get my third point, you get a kind of a new way of organizing forms. You really get a revolution, because when you flatten space, when you turn it into kind of a visual puzzle, you can reform it, you can reshape it, you can reorganize it. It certainly allows patterns to have a different role in painting. And then finally, who developed it? What happened to it as it began to emerge? I think it's fair to say that Picasso took so much of the legwork from Cezanne. Picasso, Braque, and then many others, all borrowing from each other, developed the style. And you really couldn't be a modern artist in the years before World War I without at least trying Cubism, because the effect it had on people was so potent. And you can see there was a period where Braque and Picasso began to be very, very close friends and to paint together. In fact, they spent studio time, painted together nearly every day, I think for more than a year. And their joke was that they called each other Orville and Wilbur. They thought they were like the Wright brothers, pioneering some kind of great scientific or technological enterprise. And you can see that after viewing the Demoiselles, Braque had his own take on the Cubist nude. And there's a certain measured heaviness and awkwardness in Braque. It's not as flat as Picasso's Demoiselles. He still was, wanting to give his figure bulk and volume, but that indefinite space, the coming and the going of three-dimensional form is something that he began to take from Picasso and began to experiment with in his figure paintings. So during the years after the Demoiselles, both Braque and Picasso spent a lot of time in Cézanne's territory, went back and explored where he lived, along with looking at his artwork. And you can see when you look at a Cézanne painting from the 1880s that there's a reason that an art critic gave Cubism its name from seeing what he called the little boxes on the hill. You can see that Cézanne's houses have already been simplified into sugar cubes, little boxes, geometric forms. And then Braque refines that further with these kind of terracotta colored red houses in his view of Lestat from 1908, made in the same neighborhood. And there really are some paintings where if you didn't see the signature, you wouldn't know it from maybe 1908 or early 1909. You wouldn't know what is Braque and what is Picasso. And I think another thing that Picasso said, he said, well, we were like two mountain climbers roped together, ascending the same piece. So it's a really sorry about that. So a really remarkable moment in art history where there is this shared discovery of a new way of organizing painting. Another side-by-side, you probably remember me talking about Cézanne and the way he tilted tables and he highlighted his forms with dark shadows underneath by kind of outlining them, the way that he fractured light in his paintings. And you definitely can see Picasso doing that in this kind of fantastic still life with French bread. Look at that slice he took out of the loaf of bread in the center of the table, and look at the way he's exaggerated and tilted the vessel that holds the pears. All of it is, working with Cézanne's ideas and just taking them a little bit further. So you get to what I think is a point where Cubism has become something clear and fresh and well-defined. It took a little bit of a while, but when Picasso went back to visit a Spanish town called Horta de Ebro, he made a view of a small factory there, and he really did it with this kind of crisp, I call it Monopoly Hotel Cubism. I don't think there's anybody else that calls it that, but this very crisp geometric Cubism. And take a look at that little building on the left of the screen and look at what Picasso's done to it. He tilts the roof upward, almost as if it's a one-story building in front and a two-story building in back. And then he makes the light appear to come from different sources. If you look across this painting and you imagine, what if it were a real town? Where is the light coming from? Is it coming from the left or is it coming from the right? Well, it kind of comes from both. And all these folds and creases and edges, exaggerate the effect of this multiple sourced light. And then you don't get a conventional sky. You get diagonal brushstrokes a la Cézanne, but magnified. And I had a student once say that the palm trees look like their stalks are made from paper towel tubes. It's one of the best comments I ever got in class. And they really do. They're sculpted rather than observed. So there's a tremendous artificiality and a crispness in this new emerging Cubist style. And yes, Picasso applied it to the portrait. Both of these are images of art dealers, a German and a Frenchman, Wilhelm Uhde on the left, and then Ambrose Vollard on the right. And it's interesting to talk about these paintings and ask yourself, so are these representational paintings or are they abstract paintings? It's a good conversation to have. It seems like Picasso is in the middle of those two fields. They really are approaching abstraction as he fractures the backgrounds and then fractures the features of the two sitters. And it's interesting to see what you can recognize in these paintings. And I'll tell you one of the things that's kind of humorous, but apparently Vollard, one of the ways he liked to sell paintings, he liked to sleep or pretend to sleep in his art gallery. So clients would come in and they would feel, unobserved and walk around his gallery, and then he'd wake up and sell them something. But of course you get, Vollard sleeping in his Cubist gallery, waiting to wake up and maybe sell a Cezanne to somebody. But again, look at this fantastic kind of fragmentation. We're beginning to get into something you might call faceted Cubism at this point, because it feels like you've got the facets of a gem. You have all these planes emerging from the painting. There's a side-by-side with Picasso and a Braque, maybe from the end of the period where they were working together. But you can see in Picasso's Woman with a Mandolin how she is turned into kind of a sculpture. And there are parts of her figure, like that arm that strums the mandolin. You feel like you could grab that, like it emerges from the painting. But there are other parts of a figure that seem to fade into this cascade of planes in the background. And yes, her face has been reduced to this kind of folded axe blade that folds out from one side. And when you take a look at Braque's Portuguese, I want you to notice something very significant. There are stenciled letters on the top of the painting. You can see the word bal, or ball or party up in the upper right, and then I can't tell what the word is on the left. But these stenciled letters and numbers are going to become a very, very important part of the next development in Cubism, which we call synthetic Cubism. And in synthetic Cubism, what happens is that the image becomes even flatter and has less allusions to three-dimensional space. And the subjects and the spaces and, if you will, the decoration and patterns of these images often come from real world or even collage. And I'll give you some examples. If you look at the kind of the lower left of that oval, you see chair caning, kind of like the chair caning you might get on a nice cafe chair from IKEA, let's say, because they still make that kind of chair caning. Well, if you're wondering, did Picasso paint that? No, he didn't. He actually bought some printed chair caning. He, went to the hardware store to buy, like we would buy shelf paper, tore it, and pasted it down on this oval canvas. And if you're wondering, why did he paste it and not paint it? I think you're going to love the answer. It was easier, right? Why paint that if you could go to the hardware store and buy it? And Picasso's now beginning to put wallpapers, printed materials, sometimes play tickets. He's putting printed materials and inventing collage, cut and paste as he goes. And, I've got to say, wouldn't he love Photoshop? Had to put that out there. Anyways, this tiny oval picture, and by the way, Braque and Picasso liked the oval because it was close to the view that we actually have of things through our two eyes. But this tiny oval shows a little cafe table at breakfast, complete with a pipe and a folded Paris journal. And the folded newspaper is going to become a trope of Cubism that's borrowed by Juan Gris and Braque and all the other early Cubists. Over on the right, you may see a little bit of a knife blade slicing what looks like some citrus, maybe a lemon or an orange. There's a piece of flam or pie there, and alluding to cutting and slicing also begins to appear in Cubist paintings. And one last thing, Picasso loves visual puns. If you're wondering, what is the rope around the edge? The answer is, that's the picture frame. Because think about, what a traditional picture frame looked like in this era. It was gold and it had carving, it had detail. And just like the printed, paper, Picasso thought, oh, that looks like a frame, but it's easier. And I can borrow it. I can buy it at the hardware store. So fantastic little, painting at an intellectual level, full of new ideas about painting. And talk about new ideas. We say that Picasso probably invented planar sculpture at this period. That's a replica he made later of a tiny guitar from 1912. You can see with, folds in that neck to make it three-dimensional. And you can see that it, splits into two sides. almost as if you're seeing it from the front and the back. And then something similar is expressed in this wonderful collage, where you see a playbill collaged in, you see wallpaper collaged in, you see edges and frets from the guitar. You know, the playfulness that Picasso is finding in the aftermath of Cubism is fantastic. It's going to be part of his work forever, that he has this great freedom to rearrange his subject matter. And one more, the aficionado, this man who's kind of a connoisseur on the left. It must be a Spaniard. I don't know if you can make out his top hat. You can make out the word Nîmes behind him on the left, where I believe there's a bull ring at Nîmes. You can see he's got a playbill for Le Torero down on the bottom. So he's got these, you know, stenciled letters. So you read the picture as well as looking at it. And in the collage on the right, it actually has a newspaper, kind of a serial novel that tell the adventures of a gentleman in Paris. So if you were in the museum, if you were looking at that and you could read, I think French, you could read the collage as well as pulling back and looking at it. Cubism wasn't always pretty. Picasso was having terrible marriage trouble in this era in 1913, and you can see it when he did this kind of savage Cubist take on his wife Olga, where her breasts seem like they are sliced from her body and then pinned back on. And that may come from an exercise that Picasso's father used to have him do. His father used to give him pigeon feet and pin them to a board when he was a boy and have him draw them. So maybe it's a kind of a memory of that, but it's the savage side of Cubism is that, yes, Cubism could dismember a figure along with rearranging it. And one more detail for you, you can tell, even though one of her arms is kind of a flipper, you can see her armpit hair under that kind of awful flipper that's raised to the back of the chair. So in 1917, Picasso got a terrific assignment from the entrepreneur Diaghilev. I may not have said it right, but the great impresario of ballet and dance. And he did a series of costumes for a musical called Parade. And there you see a photo of one of the original kind of Cubist costumes and then some models that had been made of them. And that really unleashed another side of Picasso that you see in the 1920s, like you see in this wonderful painting, Three Musicians. You see just a fantastic freedom to use pattern. No longer collage or wallpaper, but you have little bits of music, you know, almost as if you could play it. You have the diamonds on the outfit of the harlequin. You have these kind of the beard of the monk. You have the dots on the clarinet. Picasso just felt like, you know, visual rhythm belonged to him. And you know what? There's a little bit of Matisse in this painting too. A little bit of an homage to Matisse's color and to the way that, you know, Matisse loved pattern and decoration. All right. That brings us, take a breath there for a minute, because that was a lot to cover, right? That brings us to Guernica. And this is where Cubism serves Picasso in yet another way. It allows him to make one of the very, very few paintings of his entire career that really made a political statement. I mean, he did make a painting about the Korean War later in the 50s, and he made illustrations of Stalin for a communist newspaper before he wised up to Stalin a little bit, like many people did. But Guernica was really his great political statement and a universal statement about war and violence. So turning teacher on you, turning professor, a little bit of the historical background. I think you can imagine, or you know, you've learned about the rise in fear all across Europe as fascism gained power in Italy, Spain, and Germany. And in Spain, the Spanish Civil War officially began in July when the fascist Junta of National Defense and the Phalangelists really began gaining ground in Spain. And around this time, actually before this time, Picasso, although he was living in France, was virulently anti-Franco and participated in a lot of propaganda efforts. And his most famous was he made an etching that was printed many, many times. I think they printed thousands of copies. It was called The Dream and the Lie of Franco. And it actually was dropped from airplanes over Spain, which, be one way to collect Picasso if you had a relative that was in Spain in the 1930s. And I'll show you examples of that in a minute. But this was followed a month after he made the etching. Franco took Malaga, which was Picasso's birthplace, which offended him even more. But there's The Dream and the Lie of Franco. And Franco is that kind of wild little, I don't know what you call it, a hairy turnip, a polyp, this kind of awful toothed creature with tentacles that seems to roll across the landscape, bringing death and destruction. And there also are some scenes that I think came from the bullfight, the dying horse, from film, the image of the screaming woman with her nerves exposed, the woman with the dead child. But you can see that this is kind of a comic strip from hell of atrocities. And you can see Picasso's imagination revving up for what he was going to be painting a little bit later. And just to give you kind of comparison, because it shouldn't be funny, but it really is, take a look at this comparison between an etching that Picasso did of Franco, or one of the scenes of The Dream and Lie of Franco, and the official portrait of Franco. This is an official academic portrait that you could have found in Madrid, and you can see he's oversized, he's a saint. Everyone in the military and the church, look up to him with reverence. There's a floating white horse above his head that's going to make him, going to give him an apotheosis to rise into heaven. So you have to love the distance between the official Franco and the way that Picasso showed him, in this case, as a Don Quixote prick on a pony. I don't know how else to say it, with this kind of banner in an obscene situation. So Picasso had a great time with that. Picasso is now considered in Spain to be a rather major poet, and he was also a playwright, but he was writing a lot of poetry in the 1930s, particularly around this time, and it has a surrealist edge to it. I think he took a lot from Gertrude Stein and the repetitive way that she used language. But reading just one line of a Picasso poem, you get a feeling for the violence that he could put into verse. And this one particular poem, cries of children, cries of women, cries of birds, cries of flowers, cries of timbers and of stones, cries of bricks, cries of furniture, of beds, of chairs, of curtains, of pots of cats, and of papers. And I love the way that the poem, it describes a bombing, because it describes the destruction of people and of furniture and beds and curtains. And I love the way that it becomes more surreal as it progresses through the verse. So in April, German Stuka bombers, provided by Hitler, in support of Franco, bomb the town of Guernica with incendiary bombs. And there's so much to say about this historic air raid and why it was so offensive. But let's just say that Guernica was a civilian target. It was not a military target. There were no factories there. There were no air bases. There were no military installations. So it really was one of the world's, maybe the world's first terror bombing, just intent to try out this new dive bomber weapon, kind of a trial run for Hitler, and a chance to create terror. So Picasso, like the rest of the world, watched the newsreels in horror, and he actually had an assignment. He knew that he was going to make a mural for the World's Fair in Paris in 1937, and he had a different subject. I think his subject was the artist in his studio, but he immediately saw that Guernica was going to be his great subject, and he switched over. And with his mistress at the time, Dora Maar, taking photographs, so we have full documentation of the process, he began to make the sketches and to work on this 27-foot wide canvas. You can see he started with charcoal. It's going to be, as you probably know, a black and white painting to give it this kind of documentary feeling, a feeling like a newsreel, like it was something taken from the news. And in the finished painting, it's fair to say that there isn't a single character or event that gives us a focal point, but rather it's a great collage of images of despair and horror. A man reaching upward out of a burning building, a woman imploring, kind of asking a question, why is this happening? A wounded horse in what seems to be like a scene taken from the bullfight, a fallen warrior. And as far as the bull on the left, there are multiple interpretations of, who is the bull and why is the bull there? Some say the bull is Franco. Some say the bull is Picasso himself. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a breakdown so you can get more of a feeling for that. And let's just say that Picasso never wanted to discuss the iconography of this painting in any clear way. He wanted it to stand as a painting that you and I have to discuss and figure out. So the bull, with its two cubist eyes, almost like the eyes of an Iberian figure, confronts us, stares out at us directly, and has a tiny pointed tongue and pointed ears. Picasso had been working on bullfight paintings for a long time. And this one, I got to know this painting in person because it used to belong to Hunk and Moo Anderson, collectors that I interned for in Palo Alto in the early 70s. And they told me it was the first painting that Picasso did where he included figures, they're called the Stoic figures, looking on from the arena, observing the violence in the bull ring. But, kind of a great, gory and graphic image. The wounded horse, you can see the stake, the spear, driven into its flesh, and with this wound, has a pattern that was meant to look either like fur or newsprint. And I understand that Dora Maar did a lot of that work. Picasso actually had collaboration on this, and she did the things like making the pattern on the hide of the horse. And when he made studies for the horse, he wanted to concentrate the violence of the scene. And you can see how he does it with that pointed tongue like a weapon, eyes that appear almost to be, gouged out, teeth that stand out of the jaw like something from a cartoon. There were many works of art on Picasso's mind, just like there were when he did the Demoiselles. And I think, for example, images like the fallen St. Paul of Caravaggio was perhaps in Picasso's mind when he did the fallen warrior. Things he might have had on his mind. Certainly as a Catholic, the idea of the grieving mother of Christ, the Pietà, was an image that may have influenced this depiction of a woman who had been nursing her child, killed in the bombing raid. And of course, this revolutionary film from Russia, from Sergei Eisenstein, the battleship Potemkin. Picasso had seen that and seen the horror on the Odessa steppes, and that was on his mind when he painted Guernica. Again, going back to that quote, great artists steal. You can see him doing that to supercharge Guernica. There's a bit of a self-portrait in the man in a burning house. He looks a bit like Picasso, and look what his eyes are doing. His eyes are like tears, and they roll around on his face as if they're going different directions to express confusion and fear. And his hands seem like some kind of weird bird or flower that's been tacked onto these pipe-like arms. I call this woman the Imploring Woman, and she has incredibly oversized legs, which make you feel how hard it is for her to move forward. And I think she has something in common with this image of Greece, this allegorical image in Delacroix. He was making a series of portraits of Dora Maar all the way from the 30s and then later into the 40s. And Dora Maar was a very brilliant and very sensitive person, and being half Jewish by staying in Paris, which is what Picasso did, throughout the war. She had a tremendous sense of anxiety and nervousness. She knew they learned what was happening in Germany. She was anxious that she would be taken to a camp. I mean, there were all kinds of reasons to be anxious. And Picasso documented that in these weeping women. And in the figure on the left, one of the things he looked at when he was creating these, he looked at medical illustrations, and the tiny lines that you see there going through her distorted face are actually based on nerve paths, nerves for the eye, or nerves for the face. So if you wonder, what did Picasso say about this painting? You know, when you look and you find quotes, they are very, very hard to read. They're very ambivalent, and they're almost ridiculous. So someone asked Picasso, what's the symbolism of the bird in Guernica? And look what he said. He said, well, there's a sort of a bird, a chicken or a pigeon. I don't remember exactly what it is. Of course he remembered. This bull, well, there's this bull and there's this horse. These are animals, massacred animals. That's all, so far as I'm concerned. It's up to the public to see what it wants to see. And that's, I think, where he's really speaking the truth about his painting. The electric lamp up at the top of the painting, could that be the eye of God? I think Picasso would say, oh, there's some kind of lamp up there, but you'll have to make of it what you make of it. Is there hope in the tiny flower that's growing out by the broken sword of the warrior? Well, some kind of plant, I'm sure, is what Picasso would say. So it was indeed installed in the pavilion at the 1937 World's Fair in Paris, and then it toured quite a bit. I don't know if you know this, but it came to San Francisco MoMA. It came to Los Angeles to a private gallery. It made its way through the United States. And my understanding is that it actually did not draw all that big an audience in Paris. You know, it was talked about, but there were a lot of other things to see. I think it made a greater impact over time. And something I want to do now to just have a little fun. There has been so much that has been done with Guernica. This is happening with a lot of Picasso's paintings. They are getting animated, they're getting revisited. And in this fantastic work that was done in Spain by animation students, it has been turned into a 3D relief experience. So let me click that for you, and you can experience Guernica in a whole different way. So I can make this happen here. An anecdote and an aftermath. And I want to say something about Picasso too, because there are so many reasons to criticize Picasso. But I want to mention that he gave the equivalent of millions of dollars to hospitals in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, most of it designated for children's hospitals. So he did what he could. By 1939, over 1 million Spaniards had died in the Civil War, and Picasso never went back to Spain during his lifetime. He couldn't do that. He couldn't go there when Franco was still in power. And he did remain in Paris, where this famous story apparently took place. Picasso was more or less left alone by the Germans because he had a lot of status. He was a figure of interest. And there's a story that a German officer once, like many, came to visit Picasso's studio and saw a postcard of Guernica in the studio. And he said to Picasso, "Did you do that?" And Picasso said, "No, you did that." So the current status of Guernica is that it was returned to Spain after the end of the Franco government, and it's now behind many layers of bulletproof glass in the Prado. And I understand that next year is going to be the 50th anniversary of Picasso's death. And I think there's going to be a lot happening with that painting and with discussion of Picasso's legacy. One little promo before we go to questions and unmute. I think Martha mentioned this, but when you come back on a month from now, almost a month from now, we'll do the Faces of Power. We will talk about the Dada response to fascist culture and also show some examples of fascist architecture and the things that developed in that era. And I will go back to, there we go. Back to you.